You already know about the nature and origins of human language and how it is different from animal communication. You also know about the structures of language systems. In this particular discussion, we will try to seek answers to how language is acquired and how do different theoretical positions explain how we acquire and learn language. Further, the module will expose you to the process of understanding and producing language, parts of the brain that support language comprehension and production. But before all this, let us first understand how do we understand language. Psycholinguists describe language as having a surface structure and a deep structure. When we read something or listen to or even further produce a sentence, it is called surface structuring. It consists of the symbols that are used and their order. Deep structuring refers to the underlying meaning of the combined symbols. Any sentence can have different surface structures that will hold some deep structures as well. Let us take an example to understand this better. Ram ate the cake is one of the sentences. Consider another sentence. The cake was eaten by Ram. Eaten by Ram, the cake was. Each of the sentences convey the underlying meaning that the cake ended up in Ram's stomach. In the sentences above, the syntax of the third sentence was incorrect, but the meaning which was being conveyed in each of the sentences was clear and comprehensible. In some of the sentences, it has been seen that the single surface structure can give rise to two deep structures. This can take place when people tend to speak and use vague sentences. Let us take an example for this to further elaborate on it. The police must stop drinking after midnight. This sentence may either mean that police officers need to enforce a curfew designed to prevent citizens from drinking alcohol after midnight, or it could mean that if police officers go out for few drinks after work, they need to wrap up their drinking by midnight. In our everyday life, we are continuously reading and hearing speech. Therefore, there is a shift from surface structure to deep structure. Deep structure is the way a sentence looks or sounds to a person to give its deeper level of meaning. After some time, it is generally seen that we tend to forget the precise words used in the sentence, but we are able to recall its essential meaning. Thus, our expression of thoughts are transformed into deeper structures. Brain plays an important role in organizing, recognizing and interpreting different patterns of stimuli. These stimuli could be the sounds of some speech, shapes of the letters and even the movements that create hand signs. The same method is used by linguists to understand the joint influence of bottom-up and top-down processing in assessing linguistic stimuli. In bottom-up processing, the elements of the stimuli are analyzed individually and are further combined to a uniform perception. When we read a sentence, the brain with specialized cells does a few things. Firstly, it analyzes the basic elements, for example, analyzes the contours and the angles of lines which are present in the visual pattern. Also, it feeds the information to other cell groups which help in perceiving the letters. Therefore, the information received helps in recognizing the words, visual patterns of the letters, which are first translated into some form of visual pattern and then into auditory codes. The building blocks for any sentence are its grammatical sequence. This is called bottom-up processing. In top-down processing, sensory information is interpreted in the light of existing knowledge, concepts, ideas, and expectations. Perceptual expectations play a major role in top-down processing. It is basically people's unconscious expectations with which they hold and interpret visual patterns in light of those expectations. When we read a signpost, sometimes we misread it as per our own mindset at that time. This effect can also be seen in language, as its very important nature involves top-down processing. We tend to process the words by writing, speaking, and hearing them actively with the help of vocabulary, grammar, and other linguistic rules that are already stored in our long-term memory. Suppose there is a sentence which says, "Today is a holiday," but here in the holiday, li is missing. We can still interpret the words without difficulty, despite the absence of several letters which are basically bottom-up elements. This is possible because we have used our linguistic rules which already exist in our memory system. However, in top-down processing, we begin interpretation of a sentence spontaneously and automatically based on whatever information is available to us. We do not wait until we have analyzed all the phonemes in the sentence in order to understand it. Let us come to acquisition of language. We know that acquisition of language is one of the most amazing events in the human cognitive development. It is one of the most awesome human developments that grows at an extraordinary speed over the early childhood years. We are all aware that children grasp subtle nuances of human communication early in life. Children are able to distinguish and differentiate between various phonemes. As far as language accomplishments go, babies as young as 2 months of age start making vowel-like noises called cooing. Beginning 6 months, they begin babbling, where they repeat long consonant vowel combinations such as ba 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 and na 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 in long strings. By second year of life, they begin to appreciate grammatical rules present in their language and begin the usage of two-word utterances. By 3 to 5 years, vocabulary expands, and so does the knowledge of adult grammatical categories. When children enter school, the pool of words they possess has grown manifolds, and they understand multiple uses of the same words in differing contexts. The vocabulary keeps building over the school years, and the individual becomes a proficient language user. Children's language abilities raise some of the most puzzling questions about language development. How do children acquire such a vast vocabulary and complex grammatical rules in such a relatively short span of time? Is language a separate ability or one of the aspects of general cognitive abilities? How do children acquire language? Is it a function of one's genetic ability, or does exposure to rich environment automatically feeds into language accomplishments? Some of these questions need to be addressed. Let's try to understand how. We have got acquainted with how language is acquired over time, how it develops, but we have not examined what makes such a development possible. Each one of us uses language almost naturally, and therefore there is a tendency to assume that language is learned effortlessly by all. But have we tried to give an informed thought to the fact that language has its rules, and we are endowed with a unique ability to create infinite number of words and sentences using our repertoire of words and rules that govern those word combinations. The larger question that we will try to address here will be, what specific mechanisms help us to acquire language? Is language learned and influenced by experience, or is it a product of our biology? Let us now look at the theoretical positions taken by different language scholars over language acquisition. Unlike other areas of human development, the nature versus nurture debate extends to the topic of language development as well. Some theorists strongly assert the role of environmental influences on the learning of language, and there are others who emphasize that the role that biology plays in language acquisition is much more defining and powerful. Although each group of theorists maintain their standpoints, yet most researchers acknowledge that both nature as well as nurture interplay and contribute in language acquisition. From here we move on to understanding how each of these theorists argue on acquisition of language. As mentioned earlier, certain language experts argue that experience of a child and the context in which learning of language takes place can strongly affect language acquisition. We are talking about the behavioral or the environmental influence on language here. One of the earliest explanations came from behaviorists like Skinner, who argue that language represents chains of responses acquired through principles of classical and operant conditioning, including association, imitation, and reinforcement. Children learn language by associating words with meanings, objects, actions, and events. Upon hearing the word milk for the first time, the child does not know what it means. But when a child is given milk and the word milk is uttered alongside, the child will eventually learn to associate the word milk with the physical entity of milk. Likewise, the child's repertoire of words keeps building, in which each day a number of words keep adding. Along with this association, children also learn the rules of word combinations and syntax of language through imitating adults and others in the environment. You may have seen young children tirelessly repeating words as adults around them pronounce these words. In addition to that, when children make their first attempts at babbling, which happens to resemble mama or dada, the baby is reinforced or rewarded through smiles, hugs, and other culturally relevant forms of appreciation. This mobilizes the child to say mama more and more. When the child attempts communicating through language, he or she is encouraged and positively reinforced by those in his or her environment. And since it is a rewarding outcome for the child, the chances are that the behavior of uttering the words will be strengthened and repeated in future. Hence, environmental influences such as association, imitation, and reinforcement become instrumental in promoting and enhancing language development. However, behavior views on language are not without resistance from other theorists who believe that the complex nuances of language cannot simply be picked through positive reinforcement only. There has to be more to it that needs further exploration and verification. First, there are doubts at whether learning can account for such rapid rate at which children pick up words and rules governing the combination of those words. In addition to the rate at which language development takes place, experts question whether simply through imitation all the possible infinite combination of words can be learned. The creativity with which each of the speakers use words cannot be simply explained by any of the principles of behaviorism alone. Further, there are evidences that support the fact that children learn the syntax of their native language regardless of the fact whether they are reinforced for it or not. There seems to be certain orderliness and an apparent internal timetable for acquiring language. Behavioral views may not have been able to provide answers to some of the limitations I have just raised. Nevertheless, its contributions in describing the role of rich, supporting, and stimulating environment for language development is worth. The limitations left in the behavioristic explanations on language acquisition make us seek some of the answers through the biological basis. There are evidences which support that we are biologically endowed with the capacity to acquire language. It has been observed across different human cultures that young children show signs of language development from early life. In fact, language competencies start developing while children are too young for formal instruction. The well-known linguist Chomsky is one of the pioneers who proposed that biology plays a significant role in language acquisition. Chomsky criticized behaviorist explanations of language learning and argued that children all over the world are born with an innate language acquisition device (LAD), which represents a biological endowment that enables the child to detect the features and rules for language, including phonology, syntax, and semantics. This view supports that children are pre-wired by nature with the ability to detect the sounds, follow grammatical rules, and exceptions of particular languages. Chomsky asserted that we have an innate scheme for processing information and forming abstract structures of language. All children are born with a universal grammar, which makes them receptive to general grammatical rules which are common to all languages. This view asserts on the assumption that all the languages have certain common units such as nouns and verbs that are arranged in a systematic manner, such as subject followed by verb and so forth. Children instinctively know how to combine noun-verb to make a meaningful utterance. They use phrases such as boy eat and seldom use eat boy, which points to the fact that children seem to know the correct order of word combinations to make a meaningfully correct phrase. This innate biological ability or mechanism helps them to acquire language. There are observations that support the biological basis of language acquisition. Language development seems to follow a certain pattern across languages and cultures. Stages of language development are almost similar for children of similar ages, even though they are raised in different environments. Children respond to language stimulation and show responsiveness to human speech and sounds. All children engage in early communication through cooing and begin to babble around the same age. They make similar grammatical errors and master these over similar time periods. They use pre-verbal gestures to communicate their needs and states. Even though children who are deaf also make up their own language and gestures, which seem to follow the basic rules of sentence formation. All these provide evidence that LAD indeed exists, although as an abstract construct and not as a physical part of the brain. The presence of a universal grammar in humans is further supported by brain research, which has been taken up in the next part. Over many years of human evolutionary history, language development is relatively recent. Humans acquired language about 1 lakh years ago, and this ability is considered uniquely human, gave humans an enormous edge over other animal species, and thereby increased the survival of humans. We know that the ability to speak and understand language requires vocal apparatus, but do humans also have specific areas in the brain that support language comprehension and production? Is ability to use language dependent on support from the nervous system? This question has intrigued language researchers for long. Studies have proven that language processing primarily occurs in the left hemisphere of the brain. There is evidence that there are particular regions in the brain that support language in humans. A major breakthrough occurred in 1861 while working on a patient who suffered injury to the left side of the brain. Paula Broca, a French surgeon, found that the patient could speak only one word, and that was tan, the name by which he later came to be called. Due to the head injury, Tan suffered from aphasia, a loss or impairment of language ability caused due to brain damage. The area of the brain that was damaged in Tan was in the left frontal lobe that directs the muscle movement involved in speech production. Individuals with damage in the Broca's area have problems in saying words correctly. In 1874, Carl Wernicke showed that a lesion in the left temporal lobe also affected language processing, but of a different sort than that tied to Broca's area. This is another area in the brain, damage to which can also impair language. This area, called Wernicke's area, is a portion of the left hemisphere temporal lobe, and this is concerned with understanding language. Individuals with damage to this area often produce fluent but incomprehensible speech, and they have difficulty comprehending words. That is, they hear the words but cannot understand their meaning, and hence language comprehension, both written and verbal, is affected in such individuals. The discoveries of Broca's and Wernicke area and their role in language processing and production form some of the landmarks in understanding the neurological connections between brain and language. Yet, considering the complex structure of brain and assuming that no matter how much we know about the brain, there is much more that remains to be explored. Till now, we argued for a strong case in support of genetic basis of language acquisition. However, a controversial aspect of Chomsky's theory is that it ascribes a small role to children's environment in the development of language abilities. For him, the evolutionary history of the species makes language acquisition possible through language acquisition device. Experience of language may be necessary, but this experience may play a restricted role in shaping language. It is contended that the experience of hearing a particular language also triggers a child's innate ability, LAD, to speak that language. Another perspective that has attempted to describe what accounts for language development will be mentioned. It is the cognitive perspective. The Swiss psychologist Piaget considered acquisition of language within the context of a child's cognitive development. He argued that a child understands a concept prior to acquiring the particular language form associated with that concept. Until and unless the concept in question, any usage of the word will be unclear in a sentence and will be superficial. Thus, cognition plays a major role in language development. This can be explained through the concept of seriation. It is debated that there will be a point in the child's intellectual development when he or she can compare objects with respect to size. This means that the child is provided with a number of sticks or different pencils, he or she will be able to arrange them in order of size. Piaget suggested that a child who has not reached this stage will not be able to learn and use comparative adjectives like bigger or smaller usefully in sentences. Similarly, children who have not yet mastered object permanence, where children seem unaware of the existence of objects that cannot exist, will not be able to use expressions like gone appropriately. The cognitive theory draws attention to the large increase in children's vocabulary at around the age when children master object permanence, and thus suggests links between object permanence and the learning of labels of objects. Connections of the type explained are possible to trace during the first year to 18 months, but as a child continues to develop, it becomes harder to find links between language and intellect. Some studies have focused on children who have learned to speak fluently despite abnormal mental development. Syntax in particular does not appear to rely on general intellectual growth. Hence, it is neither the innate genetic cognitive ability nor environment in isolation which can fully explain how language is acquired. It is the interaction of both of these aspects that can probably be able to provide a more comprehensive view of language development, and the same will be discussed now. Interactionist approaches to language acquisition challenged the dichotomous positions that grew out of Skinner-Chomsky debate over language acquisition. It emphasized that higher levels of development emerge out of constructivist interactions between biological predispositions and environmental factors. An active child, well endowed for acquiring language, observes and engages in social interaction with others. Children have a strong native desire to interact and relate the form and content of language with its social meaning. Bruner, Locke, and others have suggested the role of adults in shaping the child's environment of communication and language inputs. Bruner suggested that the language behavior of adults when talking to children, referred to as child-directed speech, is specially adapted to support language acquisition by children. Parents and other adults scaffold for the child's language learning. This idea of scaffolding was given by Vygotsky. Bruner coined the term Language Acquisition Support System or LASS in response to Chomsky's LAT. Further, Locke asserted that each child must reinvent language for himself or herself with the help of those who already know how to use language. Therefore, the ways in which parents interact with children help increase their vocabulary and expedite development of language skills. Both Bruner and Locke's proposals resonate with Vygotsky's ideas on language. Interactionist theories have also not escaped criticism as they stress that language competencies grow out of communicative experience.